So I'm doubly mic'd up here, so if you get an echo, it's not my fault, right? Well, first of all, thank you for coming out, and thanks for organizing this. I was actually curious to see what plenty curious to come myself. I'd like to do a couple things, and including clipping this thing out of my belt, which I can barely do. I want to start with a couple words of what may be obvious, but I think bear repeating on climate change, and then talk about biofuels, which are now seen as everything from the savior of the planet to the satanic tool of BP and other big companies to destroy the planet. So I don't think there's anything sort of more controversial right now in energy issues. Maybe nuclear, but biofuels are right up there. But let me start with a couple words on climate change. And this is, everyone can hear okay? Okay. For all of the discussion about is the climate warming, how quickly are things going to happen, when are we going to see dramatic effects from climate change, that debate, which I think most scientists thought ended 4 or 5 years ago, I would argue is actually now ended for the public. I mean, there are still people who think climate change is not going on, and mostly they are foolish, but leaving that aside, there's never been a time in history when more members of the House and the Senate have their name on energy bills, climate change legislation, than today. At the peak of the OPEC crisis, at the peak of interest in energy back in the 70s, a tiny fraction of bills were actually going through. Now, my students and I probably get a call every other day from someone saying, not, can you tell me about what I should think about nuclear, or what is the cost of ethanol per liter or something. It's, I need to write a climate change bill. What should it be? And that's completely changed the dialogue so that everyone, Republican, Democrat, independent, libertarian, they are all signing up to write legislation in this area. And so any question that are we now at the tipping point when suddenly policy is happening quickly and people are inventing new things on energy, you know, all of the stuff that Al Gore talked about, when are we going to act? It has happened. It has started already. There might not be a lot of good rules out there yet and good laws out there yet, but all of the things that people were waiting to happen have suddenly broken loose. And so it's a pretty unusual moment. And so after the 8 o'clock break, we talk about what you might want to do, supporting biofuels, buying biofuels, protesting biofuels, all of which are sort of relevant, and now's the time to do them. And I've been working on energy for a fairly long time, and I've never been able to say that before. I've always before said, you know, I'm a huge fan of solar power or hydro or whatever it was, and I would wave my hands and tell as good a story as I could about why it was an interesting area that in someday might be relevant. All of those things have changed. California now has the most aggressive rules to put solar power in place. Anyone have solar on the rooftop? Anyone own their own rooftop right now? Okay, it's actually a relevant question because the way the rules are written, it discriminates against people who don't own property, which means, of course, it discriminates against those people who are already relatively rich. And most of the neat new things happening subsidize the rich at the expense of all of us. And there's a good argument why you might want to do it, but it's not fair in the short term. So there's a lot of things that are changing, but there's also a lot of features that are set up in a very complicated way. The city of San Francisco and California, that combination has the most progressive laws to support solar power of any set of a state or nation, now that we're the nation of California, and a city on Earth. Germany has a more aggressive policy, but it's very complicated, and you can't sort of be an owner as an individual. It's a different sort of mix. So all of the arguments about when is it time to act, when is money really being spent, when is the decade going to happen when climate and energy are front and center, it's now. And waiting, if you're interested to get involved when it's really rolling, will simply put you kind of behind the curve. So this is an unusual moment. I don't think I've ever said that before. So it's a neat starting point. I'll just turn to biofuels, but just say who I am first, because it might help a little bit. I'm a physicist by training who got into energy while working on renewable energy technologies for the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. when the U.S. was blockading, had an embargo against Nicaragua, and have been working on energy systems ever since. I run something called the Renewable Energy Laboratory at UC Berkeley, of which we have one graduate, Garrett, in the room here, who I definitely going to embarrass at some point later on. And I also am the co-director of Berkeley's Institute for the Environment. I doubt many of you have heard of RAIL or BIE, the Berkeley Institute of the Environment. Aside from Garrett, and so before you read the propaganda here, who had heard of either one of those? My goodness. Well, you don't count. All right, I see. We have a ringer. Okay. But the thing you probably all have heard about is the fact that in February, Berkeley and the University of Illinois, as a partnership, were awarded the largest research contract any university in the world has ever received, as a single contract. And it's a $500 million 10-year grant from British Petroleum. Now they're called Beyond Petroleum, and they have a somewhat complicated environmental and human rights record, as probably many of you know, with dead refinery workers in Texas and a trail of sort of ugly atrocities in the Niger Delta in Nigeria. They are a company in need of good PR, to say the least. That said, BP is probably the most progressive fossil fuel company on Earth right now. You can sort of quibble a little bit, but BP has done more positive things than any of the other big companies. And so BP comes with some significant baggage, but they're also putting the largest single chunk of money into biofuel research of anyone on the planet. And just to put it in perspective, $500 million. The United States government spends about $3 billion on all energy research each year. The U.S. pet food industry spends more money on research than does the U.S. government on energy research. Right? So putting in perspective, how many minutes in Iraq is $3 billion? It's actually about, what, 4 days right now of expenditures in Iraq is the $3 billion that we spend annually on energy research. And if you think that oil has anything even remotely to do with our involvement in Iraq, that's a bizarre ratio. Right, spending roughly $1 trillion on the Iraq situation, and $3 billion annually on research on the thing that would allow you to actually pick your own energy future, as opposed to considering where to invade based on where the oil is. So, it's a big chunk of money, but on the other hand, $500 million that BP's putting into this biofuel program, that's about as much money as it takes to bring one new drug to market. Turns out that Viagra costs almost $1 billion. So, but the PT Cruiser, that car cost about $500 million in research to put on the road. As exciting and wonderful and thrilling that it is. So that kind of puts in perspective, how much we're spending here. So why biofuels? Now back to the main topic for today. Why are biofuels interesting, and why is what's going on with the BP and UC Berkeley operation kind of an interesting moment? Up until about, 4 or 5 years ago, there was real uncertainty if you make a biofuel. And the main biofuels I'll be talking about tonight are ethanol, right? This stuff basically. And then biodiesel, a thicker version, and butanol. And I'll come back to butanol later on. But between biodiesel and ethanol, that's basically the main biofuels we're talking about. This is basically what you get when you ferment sugars. Okay? So the two forms of biofuels we talk about most often are corn-based ethanol, and then ethanol from something called cellulosic materials. Cellulose is the hard little fibers in wood, in the stronger plants, in switchgrasses and in bamboos and all kinds of things. When you grind them up, if you grind up corn in your fingers, you get mush, corn mush. That's why they call it that. That's starch. When you grind up material from this chair, you get those little soft little splinters. What gives those splinters their hard form are the ligands, the long bonds. And my favorite way to think about it is what happens if you leave a piece of bread out in the rain or this chair. Just the action of some warm water on the starch in bread will break it down. You'll get a little pile of mush. And if you really squeeze that piece of soggy bread hard, you would get out this stuff. You could squeeze this table, this chair all you want, and you won't get a whole lot of ethanol out. Okay, so the process to get ethanol from this stuff is much more difficult than it is to get it out of corn. And the benefits of making ethanol from corn are pretty mild. And this was something that our lab did, and one of the papers there called Ethanol Can Contribute blah 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 is a paper about it. And so for a long time the debate was, does it make sense to make ethanol out of corn? The reason why corn is interesting is because we have a lot of it, right? We grow lots of corn in the United States. But it's not a very good biofuel. It turns out that if you make corn into ethanol, that the energy balance, meaning how much energy goes in to make that ethanol relative to how much energy you have in the ethanol itself, is not very significant. It's 20% or so better to take gasoline, run tractors, plant crops, grow plants, then put those plants, that corn, in a digester or a refinery and make ethanol. So it's better than gasoline, but it's not a big victory. It's not a home run. You probably wouldn't want to change your whole economy based on that 20% improvement. And that doesn't even take into account the fact that making ethanol from corn is land intensive and requires lots of fertilizer and irrigation, all of which require fossil fuels. That's why the balance is so small. So there's a bit of a nerdy version of it, but the basic story is that we have optimized corn in this country to be as fossil fuel intensive as possible, which sounds stupid. Why have we done that? Because fossil fuel energy, gasoline and oil, are very cheap in this country. We subsidize them in lots of interesting ways, including spending lots of money to invade other countries. And that provides a big subsidy for corn. And if you're a corn grower and you want to get more yield, you basically apply more fossil fuels. You fertilize more, you irrigate more, you put more greenhouse gas producing fossil fuels into the soil to get more corn out. It's a crazy balance. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But we grow lots of corn, so we want to make our corn into something besides feedstock for animals and pizza dough, etc. In Brazil, they make ethanol out of sugarcane. And instead of being 20% better on an energy balance if you make corn into ethanol, if you make sugarcane into ethanol, it's 800% better. So there's a whopping return on an energy basis if you use sugarcane, which is sugar, which is what you want to make into the ethanol. But there are a few minor downsides to making sugarcane into ethanol, including, what's that? Right, Brazil is a good place to grow sugarcane because it's hot and it's wet, but some of the hottest, wettest areas are rainforests we might like to protect, and they are the Cerrado, the areas surrounding the rainforest we also might want to protect. So there's a real trade-off between growing more ethanol and chopping down natural resources. And so while the energy balance is good for sugarcane, it's not a winner in terms of environmental protection. Unless Brazil was to be really, really careful and only use degraded land in the cities and blah, 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 which is could do, but it's not very likely. That's where the cellulosic stuff comes in. The benefit of using woodier materials is that a lot of woody crops are either available to us as waste today. Much of the waste from this bar is going to eventually find its way, even though San Francisco is a real recycling leader, it's going to find its way to the Altamont landfill, where it's going to rot and produce methane, and that's a very potent greenhouse gas. A much better use for that stuff, no offense to the bar, a much better use for all this municipal waste would be to find the right bacteria and microbes to break it down into ethanol. Instead of having to pay a waste management company to go take away the waste, you would actually get paid. So instead of you paying a tipping fee to get rid of your waste or your yard waste, you would get paid to make ethanol, which you could then use. And that would remove that greenhouse gas stream from the air. So there's some real positives if we could use up all of our municipal waste, if we could use the waste from sawmills, if we could grow some of the crops like switchgrass that President Bush said, I'm going to grow switchgrass on my ranch in Crawford, Texas, etc., to grow biofuels in the State of the Union address he gave in 2006. We have lots of degraded land where you can grow these woodier crops with very little input of irrigation and of fossil fuel fertilizers. So you could, in fact, really build your biofuel economy up based on a lot of land areas that right now are degraded, that need to be repaired. So there's a real upside. Now, if we took all of the corn and all of the soy we grow in this country and made it into ethanol, we could offset about 10% of our gasoline. That is not very exciting. That is not going to solve the Iraq problem. That's not going to solve our energy security problem. It's not going to do any big deal. But if you start talking about all of this degraded land in the US, around the world, you could really think about growing these cellulosic crops and ramping up significantly the sustainable nature of biofuel production and meet a large amount of our liquid fuel needs. In California, half of our greenhouse gas emissions come from our vehicles because we are relatively efficient for our homes, but relatively hogs when it comes to big Hummers and driving too much. So for us, the state that has the most aggressive greenhouse gas law in the world, we need to reduce the amount of emissions from our vehicles. And there's an op-ed from the Chronicle in the back that both highlights California's landmark greenhouse gas law, something called the California Global Warming Solutions Act that Fran Pavley, assemblywoman from Southern California, got passed, of which the governor has gone on the cover of Time magazine saying, I'm very much for this law, etc. And so California has set this very strict standard. California wants to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by a quarter in the next 2 decades, and by 80% by 2050. That's unheard of. Right now our emissions are rising and we want to drop them by 80%. So we're going to need solutions like biofuels, but biofuels alone aren't going to solve the problem. It's the combination of biofuels and solar and hydro and wind, and the big one that everyone's going to have to figure out where they stand on, nuclear. There are good arguments to be pro-nuclear if you're climate conscious, and there are good reasons to be anti-nuclear if you want to survive the next accident. Nuclear is kind of the big wild card out there. And nuclear relates in an interesting way to biofuels. When you grow plants and then make them into ethanol, like we've just been talking about, that's one way to use the biomass. Another way to use the biomass is to either just simply never make it into ethanol, burn it, or do something called gasify it, which basically, if you heat up biofuel, anything, if you heat up yourself in a, you know, when you croak, what's it called? What's that? In a kiln, yeah. When you get incinerated, right? Because that you give off gas, and those kinds of gases, and from burning this wood or from driving off the gas from them, are all ways to skip the liquid fuel stage and go directly into natural gas. I don't mean the natural gas we get out of oil wells. This is real natural gas made from living things. And you can then have gas that you could burn in a power plant. Power plants make electricity. You could then charge up your electric cars, as an example, with biofuel. And I don't think anybody knows today whether a better use of a pound of biomass is to make it into ethanol and put it in your car, or to take that pound of biofuel and gasify it and run a power plant and then have clean electricity. Because if you grow as many biofuels as you burn, the growing absorbs as much greenhouse gases as you give off when you burn it, roughly. And if you then make electricity that's clean, and you then charge up your electric car, that may be a better long-term solution. And I don't think anybody actually knows what's better. The grant from BP is intended to study all of those things. to study making ethanol from cellulosic material. We've already decided that we're going to forget the corn route, which really ticked off the Midwest corn lobby. But we can make ethanol from cellulosic materials, or we can gasify that stuff and make electricity. And as soon as you start talking about electric cars out there being charged up by electricity, nuclear suddenly becomes part of the equation again. And nuclear has huge problems. California is the only state, I think, is the only state that has a law saying you may not build more nuclear plants. That's settled law. But there are efforts to repeal that law. So even California is now getting into the game of what to do with this. Now I'm going to stop there because I see hands up, and we can go back to some more of these things. But hopefully I've opened up a lot of the questions, and we'll now kind of figure out where to go. So why don't we start here?
I just want to make a comment when you're talking about the fact that we need, a variety of solutions to meet. When you're talking about the fact that we need a variety of solutions to meet all of our energy needs, maybe you weren't, so let's take them all. But the one that I wanted to mention that I think is the biggest one is conservation.
Okay, so conservation and energy efficiency. And I completely agree up to a point. Conservation, i.e., these light bulbs are rather inefficient. Yeah. Conservation is not only the cheapest option, but it's the one where you can get returns right away. 10 years ago, you could not find a compact fluorescent light bulb that would do what that halogen does. Now you can get ones that are pretty good, and unlike waiting 10 years or 12 years for a payback on my investment in photovoltaic solar panels on my roof, if the bar went energy efficient tomorrow, your energy bill the next month would be lower. And there's huge numbers of studies. California has been one of the global leaders in putting in energy efficiency, not just better light bulbs, but better water heaters, using the waste heat from a nearby, a dry cleaner to power the next building next to it, etc. So you're right. It's a big deal. The problem is that energy demand around the world is growing fast enough in places that don't have lots of wasted energy around, that while we could cut our emissions in the US and Europe dramatically, the biggest growth of energy use around the world is in developing countries. And if we want to meet the 80% target that the governor has set, that's the right scientific target, 80% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050, that's the target the governor signed, we're going to need more than just energy efficiency. And so you're right, it is the first thing you should do, but we're going to need a set of these low carbon technologies as well. Went in the back.
What about gasification on individual vehicles as opposed to gasification into electricity? Are the trade-offs that the electricity loses energy as it transports itself on the grid versus gasification on the individual vehicle releases particulates into the air?
Yeah, so this is actually tricky. You probably would not want to have a gasifier in the back of your car. I have seen one vehicle with a gasifier in the back, and it was a dump truck in North Korea, in Pyongyang, where they had a pile of coal in the back, and they had a gasifier, and it looks like a washing machine with pipes coming out. There are better ones, but the problem is to lug around your fuel. Your solid fuel is unlikely to be a good deal on an energy efficiency basis unless we come up with some real dramatic breakthroughs. Wood chips are pretty heavy. Remember, solid biofuels are not as easy, as light, as energy dense as liquid fuels. The reason why gasoline is so attractive is that it is an incredibly high energy fuel. Having wood chips in the back of your car, unless you're on a farm, it's a tough way to go. Doing it in central plants is a much more efficient way to do it and to put the electricity into your car. So again, unless there's some dramatic breakthrough, that's unlikely to be a winner. But with a country that's only investing $3 billion a year in all of our energy research, we have hardly begun to figure out all the options. So let me come over here and then come back.
You mentioned that you want, or that the government wanted 80% reduction. You mentioned that there's going to be an
percent reduction by 2050. Where does that 8% number come from? What's the justification for it?
Okay, so the governor signed executive order in 2005. He actually signed it on World Environment Day down on Van Ness. There's a big ceremony. Of which, Garrett, how many different, and Brooke, how many cities were present? Oh, of around the world, 200 roughly? City mayors were there at the signing of this event where the governor said, we're going to cut our greenhouse gas emissions by 80%. And the reason why he signed it politically was to really screw the Democrats. But the reason why he signed it scientifically, and he did, the Democrat lawmakers said their jaws dropped because they wanted to do it, and the governor beat him to it. But the reason why it happens scientifically is because the international community doing climate change work has looked at the total amount of greenhouse gases being emitted by the world, of which the U.S. emits a quarter of the total. And we need to get that number down from 7 billion tons of carbon in the year, going into the air each year. We need to get that down to under 2. So an 80% reduction from the current level is the scientific best estimate for where we want to be. Now, that's a target no one's ever achieved. I mean, this is something that has never happened. Remember, California, this climate leader, we're still growing in emissions. So we haven't even started downwards yet, and we're talking about going down by 80%. Even an 80% reduction is not going to remove all of the surprises in the greenhouse. We may well see, even if we can meet this target, that the ice caps on Kilimanjaro and Mount Kenya and in Peru, they're gone. That we may still have the problem where there's no more North Pole ice in the summer anymore. We may still see dramatic changes in fish populations. But the 80% target is the current scientific best estimate for if we choose to go beyond, if we don't get down to that level, the surprises waiting for us in a warmed world are likely to be more catastrophic than less. So it's kind of a line drawn in the sand around the best current science. And the fact that the governor jumped in and said, I'm not going to talk about the Kyoto Protocol, which is a 7% change, or for us it would be 5. I'm going to jump to, in the long term, in 45 years from now, 43 years from now, what the scientists are telling me is the right answer, was a pretty brilliant stroke. Because it basically put all of best science behind a Republican governor, which is not something which happens often. So it's an interesting event, and it's the right number. We may discover in 10 years that it's not 80%, but we need to go to 82, or maybe it's 76, but it's going to be something on that order. We're not likely to see, oh, we were so wrong, it's actually 3%. That's not going to happen. No.
Getting back to biofuels.
Okay.
Getting back to biofuels, you were talking about the ethanol or the waste wood.
Right.
Regardless of how you're growing the crop, water is a huge issue, especially in the future. Now and in the future, there are already wars being fought over water. So it seems to me a concern that water is going to be diverted away from food and drinking water toward this end. So what?
Okay. So the water issue, right? You guys, I mean, so my card for the suggestion box is to have someone come and talk about the coming water wars, because you're absolutely right. I mean, this is a big deal. Biofuels require a lot of water. They don't require a lot of water relative to other crops we grow. All crops we grow commercially today in the U.S. are pretty water intensive. Thousands of gallons per ton of output is a standard number. So water intensive is what agriculture is. That doesn't mean, though, that there aren't some ways to address that problem. When there's been concerted efforts to make cropping more water efficient, like drip irrigation versus flooding fields. And we have farmers in California, because their water is subsidized, even though we live in a desert, where they flood the fields not because it's good for the crops, but because that water has almost no value for them. In fact, we have farmers who get water free from the state system, and then they flood the fields, they evaporate tons of it off, and they sell the extra to cities like Fresno only because it's more convenient to sell it than just to let it spill off into the desert. So, water is not managed well for a variety of reasons. Most of the approaches talked about for how to fix that are, we should actually put a price on water that reflects its value as a starting ground. Just like we should put a price on carbon that we don't want emitted. I didn't say energy, right? I said carbon. And we've heard people talk about BTU taxes. That's an energy tax, which makes very little sense. You don't want to tax energy because some energy is good and clean, other energy is carbon intensive and dirty, and so you want to regulate the thing that you don't want. In the case of global warming, it's the greenhouse gases, the carbon. So on the back side of that op-ed is something that the governor, is an article about something the governor signed in January, and it's called the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, which is about the nerdiest title possible. But what it says is California is going to change the blend of fuel we have. Doesn't mean we're going to we're going to put an MTBE or something. It means instead of selling in our pumps gasoline with a certain average amount of greenhouse gases of carbon in it, California is going to set a standard for its fuels that's cleaner than gasoline. So there's a couple ways to meet that standard. One is you can make your vehicles more efficient so they use less. Another one is you could blend in to your liquid fuel mix with your gasoline biofuels. Now let's say, for argument's sake, it turns out that what California has written into law is we're going to make our blend 10% better by 2020. Doesn't sound like a lot, but because vehicles are on the road a long time, gas stations are slow moving, it's actually a pretty reasonable standard. But we actually think California could get 30 or 40% better. Let me use 20% for an example. Let's say that California said, we're going to make our gasoline 20% better. Then we're going to make our liquid fuel 20% better than gasoline. Remember before I said that ethanol on average is 20% better than gasoline? That would mean that we could just simply replace all of our gas with ethanol and be done. But nothing works so simply. So a more likely case is what we would do is we would start to blend in not just ethanol from corn at 20% better than gasoline, but some of the cellulosic stuff that's 60 or 80% better, and then the average mix would be brought down to 20% better. So California is going to set this standard to make our biofuels better on average. And then just like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Air Act signed in 1970 doesn't say the air is going to have a certain amount of dirt in it. What the Clean Air Act says is we're going to make the air cleaner year after year after year based on new technology, new ability to monitor what's going on, and new observed human health effects. So California plans to use this standard to ratchet down how dirty our liquid fuel is year after year after year. And already two of the presidential candidates, McCain and Obama, have already adopted and said they're going to propose a federal version of the standard. And there's a law that's working its way through committee in Congress to have a federal version. So suddenly we have a policy mechanism to drive us towards cleaner fuels, of which good biofuels would qualify. Now, why is this important? Anyone remember the pictures of President Bush going to Brazil and hugging President Lula? It's kind of a bizarre scene, right? Lula's a socialist, right? So this couldn't be weirder in some sense. So this is true biofuel diplomacy, right? President Bush now loves Brazil, not because we're in line with them on social issues, but because they have sugarcane ethanol, and now we've decided gasoline is bad and ethanol is in. Well, if you make, let me give you two examples. If you make ethanol from corn in a distillery run by coal, we have many of those in the US right now, the resulting ethanol, even though it's supposed to be a green or yellow fuel, is dirtier for the environment than gasoline, because you burn all that coal to make the ethanol. If, on the other hand, you make ethanol from cellulosic materials in a plant run by natural gas, or even better, run by wind or solar power, that fuel is 90% better than gasoline. So how you make it matters greatly. And so the president's rush to embrace ethanol and huge subsidies being given out to corn ethanol plants in the US couldn't be more wrong-headed. I mean, it's like the cartoon version of what a real policy would be. A real policy would be low carbon fuel standard like California, or finding a set of ways to subsidize cellulosic ethanol, or making our vehicles more efficient, which we haven't done in 20 years. Those would be things that would actually be a smart policy, but that somehow was lost on Washington. It's a very long answer. Apologies.
I'm a surprise question here. What is the emission trail going to look like from an ethanol blended fuel versus what we have now, and what are the potential health effects?
And ethanol, the emission trail means what comes out of the back?
Versus our standard gasoline.
I see. Okay.
Right now, what does the emission trail look like?
Okay. So by emission trail, I'm just going to take it you mean what gets spit out of the tailpipe. Okay. There was a recent high-profile paper on this that I happen to personally think got some of it wrong, but the conclusion from this study was that in terms of cancer-causing elements coming out of the tailpipe, an ethanol blend is just about the same as a gasoline blend. And that the amount of asthma cases is likely to rise by a few percent. That, however, assumes the blend of ethanol we get is not an overly clean blend. So most of the analysis that is being done at the lab at Berkeley, at the US National Labs in Colorado, point to a blend of ethanol called E85, as you said, which means 85% ethanol, 15% gasoline. That a blend you would use here that would actually significantly reduce health impacts. And that's largely because there's a lot of junk in gasoline that we've regulated down somewhat, but not all that far. But an ethanol blend would actually burn somewhat cleaner. So it's not going to produce a big change in health impacts either way. However, if we go not towards these liquid fuels, but what I mentioned before, running plug-in hybrid cars that are charged up by low-carbon fuels, that would have a dramatic health effect. Because a plug-in hybrid car is a car that's going to mainly run off of its battery. And a battery vehicle has no emissions. So one of the options on the table now is a vehicle that would dramatically improve urban air quality because there'd be no tailpipe emissions. So there's a lot of options on the table that could get there. But remember, vehicles are really frustrating to work on. To totally turn over the fleet of cars in California, we have 17 million cars. That fleet replaces itself, incrementally every time you go buy a new car. But it takes about 15 years on average for all of the vehicles on the road today to be off the road. So you don't get really fast changeovers unless you get creative and do things like Los Angeles did at one point and have the Cash for Clunkers program, where they gave you $700 to bring in a car that was older than a certain point in time. And it turned out that getting 5% of the oldest, dirtiest cars off LA's roads in the 70s reduced air quality related illnesses by almost 40%, because the dirtiest few cars were dramatically the largest polluters. So combining programs like this biofuel stuff with ways to get the dirtier cars off the roads, I would, for example, do a Hummer and SUV buyback program myself. To get those off the roads, that would have the biggest effect. In other words, I have to really get the number right, every Jeep Cherokee running on gasoline, I'm assuming it gets 12 miles to the gallon, that you get off the road is equivalent to converting 3 to 5 compact regular gas cars to hybrids. Right? In other words, the benefit of getting the dirtier cars off the road is significant. So if you really want to make a difference here, you would actually start with the dirtier, uglier cars.
Okay. I'm right behind you here. My question is about total energy usage and the liquid fuels portion of that. On Earth, we use roughly 4 quadrillion BTUs of energy a year, 4 quads.
Whoa.
What? No?
400 quads.
400 quads. Yeah. I'm sorry, thank you.
The U.S. uses a quarter of that, so my number is the U.S. uses 100 of these quads. Yeah.
Good. Pull the right number. And I've seen some studies that suggest that to get the entire world population, as it stands today at roughly 6 billion people, to a Western European level of energy usage would take 7 to 8 quads, 7 to 800 quads.
Right. So like doubling. Right.
And if we assume that population will level off at its best case scenario, that takes us to 12 to 1600. Is there any studies that you know of that have been done which suggest that we can get that much from a combination of biofuels and other renewable sources, or is economic inequality from an energy standpoint basically our life?
Okay, so there's a lot wrapped up in this question. There's a lot of different features. I'm going to avoid the numbers part of it, but the answer is yes. There are lots of studies that say we can get there, because you can assume all kinds of things about where we might go and conclude that there's enough energy out there. But studies are cheap, and basically the operating word in the energy world is that forecasts for where we're going to be are guaranteed to be wrong. That doesn't mean, though, that we couldn't do it. But here are some of the things that are on the table that you've got to deal with. Half of U.S. electricity comes from coal. And if you look at just the number of coal-fired power plants that the U.S. wants to build, India wants to build, and China, just those 3, if those coal-fired plants get built over the next decade, we will have, in my view, misspent over $1 trillion. And the reason is that most of those plants, if we build them, are going to be with us for 5 or 6 decades. That's the history of coal-fired power plants. You go look at them, and there are plants operating today that were built World War II. So every bit of coal we build today is a legacy of carbon emissions that's going to be really hard to beat down in the future. China, each of the last 2 years, installed more new power plants than the entire power base of California. And it's going to be a long time, most people think, before China starts building clean power plants, largely because the biggest example out there is us, and we're building dirty ones, right? So there's a real issue of who steps out first. Now, recently there was a landmark event that happened. A big Texas energy company called TXU that was set to build 11 coal-fired power plants was bought out in the first hostile green takeover in history. A set of green investors, actually, of the many heroes in the story, the Natural Resources Defense Council, and the San Francisco branch of that, and a former Republican head of the EPA, William Riley, convinced TXU to take a buyout to turn off their coal power plant purchases and to go for a mix of efficiency, wind, and what? Zero coal. Nuclear. Nuclear. Right. Which brings us back to the N-word. This is the thing that I think everyone's going to have to figure out what they want to do. And if you ask for something to get involved in, I would argue there's 3 things that you want to do. You want to do as green a lifestyle as makes sense for you, both so you can figure out how transformative or not it is to cut your utility bill through energy efficient light bulbs and wrapping the water heater and having the utility do an energy audit and driving a more efficient vehicle? And then do you want to then invest in, right now PG&E allows you for I think $5 extra per month, a new program to essentially offset all of your carbon, because PG&E will use your $5 a month to go invest in wind and solar, etc. I personally think it's a great program, even though it's coming with a lot of PR. Brooke, do you want to comment on? Brooke may have some negatives to say about the PG&E program.
The only thing I don't like about it is that it only invests in trees, it only invests in forestry.
Okay, so Beth is right on. Right now, the program only invests in offsetting carbon by growing trees because it's cheap. But PG&E has promised that the program will expand into clean renewables over time. Brooke is more skeptical. Brooke was a student of mine at one point. Brooke is more skeptical than I. I tend to be naive when people do what they say. So, nuclear is this key issue that you want to think about, because deciding where you stand on it's going to be very important. There's lots of opportunity to protest nuclear or to be in favor of it, and I really think this is because we have in the U.S. a quarter of the world's nuclear power plants. And if I were to ask my students 10 years ago, ask them to put up their hands, who's in favor of nuclear? 0. Or 1 or 2 of the wayward nuclear engineers in the room would raise their hand. Everyone else would say no. When I asked the class, I think I did that your year, and it was 60% pro-nuclear. So the thing that the nuclear industry has been waiting for, our citizens to rise up, as they put it, is happening, for better or worse. The U.S. has 100 nuclear power plants, and all of those are getting old. Those plants are going to need to be replaced over the next couple decades. They can be replaced with more nuclear plants, making more waste, or they can be replaced with other technologies, although it's hard to replace a nuclear power plant with zero carbon sources. You need a lot of windmills, a lot of solar, a lot of efficiency. So it is going to be a challenge, but it's part of your question. Can we actually build up enough low carbon power? Personally, I would much rather live next to a nuclear power plant than a coal-fired power plant. But I want to live nowhere near the waste cycle of that nuclear plant. And that puts me in kind of a hypocritical position. It's not clear, I think, what is the right choice on nuclear. Not because I think the nuclear industry is likely to do a good job. It's proven to do a really bad job, not on operating the plants, but operating the cycle. But if you take those nuclear plants out of commission, like Germany's decided to do, although they're revisiting it, you make the climate job much more difficult. And so getting to this 400 or 800 quads of clean energy without nuclear, I think is going to be a huge challenge. Can we do it? Yes. But the number of scenarios to get there is very small. So a very long answer. I apologize.
It's about 8 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and take a break. Give Dan a chance to catch his breath because he's been answering a number of questions. Thank you so much for